welcome everyone. Very nice to see you all responding to our invitation to this webinar on ethnographic research and its relevance for supply chain management. We actually had quite a few questions and quite a few proposals already shared with us on the using this method, ethnographies. So I think there was quite a lot of, or there is a lot of excitement around it. So organizing this and webinar, I think all of us are looking forward to it, including the organizers. So we will start recording the session. You already know the drill by now. We have to do it so that hopefully everything goes well this time, and we can, and we can share this on YouTube for those of you that could, or those people that could not be with us today. Right, so maybe you can move to the next slide, Victoria. Just to recap a few announcements, a few things going on. You already know this webinar series is linked with our special developmental issue, how we would like to call it, because it's not really a typical special issue. We already had a couple of webinars. The discourse studies webinar was a few weeks ago. Today we do ethnographic research. Next week, it's the webinar on engaged research. So May 21st, we already announced that. It will be later on out in LinkedIn. We have two speakers, Henk Akkermans, Anne Tubulic, both of them excellent speakers for engaged research. Visual methods confirmed June 2nd in the afternoon, so 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And there will be a follow-up on ethnographic research, hopefully with a lot of questions that you all have today, which we'll have the opportunity to go deeper, tentatively on June 9 with Lorenzo Scade, who's also really looking forward to contribute to this. And then there's the conference season. Euroma, we'll see some of you in Euroma, at Euroma in Vienna. If you want to send your proposal to be part of the special session, please send it to us by June 15. If you want to be part of the Academy of Management session in Philadelphia, please send to us your proposal by June 30. And I think these are the announcements. If you have questions, organizational questions regarding the special issue, please post it in the chat and we will also respond as we continue. So today, ethnographic research and relevance for supply chain management. Three excellent speakers. Julia, who will start, she's in Sweden at Stockholm University. She will start with a crash course on ethnographic research. Then Leon will take over and will talk a little bit about his very recent experience of being in the field and engaging in ethnographic research. And then Anna will provide the insights on actually also how to get the ethnographic research published. So yeah, really looking forward. I think, Julia, I'll give it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thanks so much for having me. Very excited to be here and speak a little bit about how I have conducted ethnographic research in the context of supply chains. My name is Julia Grimm. I'm an assistant professor at Stockholm University. And yeah, I will share sort of what has worked for me. And it may sound a little bit prescriptive, so take it with a grain of salt. I mean, ethnography is really all about sort of cultural understanding through immersion in the field. So there is no right or wrong in that sense. There is no template. Ethnography can mean very different types of data and very different forms of analysis. So I will really just talk you through sort of what has worked for me. So now you click. Thank you very much. So I mean, what I usually start with when I think about an ethnographic study that I want to start off with, and here I draw a little bit on what Anne Langley, Juliane Reinecke, and I wrote about in our 2024 piece for JSCM. Usually I think about, okay, what's sort of the temporal focus of my study? Do I want to trace something backward, or do I want to follow something forward in real time, or do I sort of want to combine these views and do both? What is the case that I want to look at? Is it a single case study? Is it a multiple case study? Are these multiple cases embedded or nested within a single case? And then what are the data within these cases? And what's my unit of analysis? Is it on an organizational, inter-organizational level? Do I want to look at a network or dyad, or do I want to look at a temporal unit of analysis, like an event or an episode of change or something like that? So in a piece that I've written together with Stephanie Strake and Marco Berti, what we did was a multi-sided ethnographic study, so a sort of nested single case, if you want. So we followed a lead firm across from Germany to China and looked at the lead firm and went into that organization, so did an intra-organizational view here between different departments, and then also looked at how this lead firm is interacting with a couple of their suppliers, and then also looked intra-organizational in these different suppliers between the factory floor or the factory management and the workers. So it was sort of our unit of analysis were both the intra-organizational relationships and the intra-organizational relationships. And if you want, so our unit of data, and that's a term that Silva and Meyer have coined, paper I can recommend from them, were then the interaction traces between the respondents. And it was a very generative and very, very interesting kind of unit to zoom in on. And that's also something that's not very studied in supply chain management. Interestingly, I think Brahma et al. They have looked at that more closely in 2011, and they found that only 8% of studies focus on these inter-organizational aspects, which is, however, super important if we want to better understand complex supply chain realities. So can really recommend sort of to look at that kind of unit of analysis. Okay. And then, okay, if I think about what kind of data do I want to collect, I think I personally think that the most generative data sort are field notes, or sort of what comes out of an observation, either your written notes or your, not yet, but anyways, your written notes or your recorded records. So what I usually do is that I go into the field first with pen and pencil, with pencil and paper, really, to not disrupt the field too much, and make notes of, just bullet points of anything I see, also drawings of how people sit, what is their posture, how do I experience room, what's the temperature, things like that. And then obviously expand on that later on, at home when I sort of write down my reflective accounts. Okay, next. Thank you. Another very, very important data source for ethnographic research is audiovisual or visual data. So photographs and videos that either you take as the researcher or that participants take. Because I think generally it's more interesting to look at what you can see than what people tell you, because what people tell you is usually a little bit biased and they leave out important information, such as power, for example. So as you see on that photograph that comes, that is a data source in this, Schrage et al. 26 paper, where my colleague was in China on the factory floor. And me and the other co-author looked at it, we were like, okay, this screams of power symmetry. And eventually this became a paper around power, which is of course something we didn't initially sort of detect through the interviews, because people don't talk about power. That's not something they would just naturally talk about. So yeah, this kind of material can really help you to detect topics that you wouldn't even think about at first. Okay, next. And then what is also super generative and important in ethnographic research for ethnographic data sources are interviews. Of course, formal interviews are important, but I think even more so conversational or informal interviews. And that naturally arises when you talk with your informants about, yesterday I saw this and this, what did you mean by that? That's an important data source. And then, of course, artifacts and documents, so anything that sort of encodes meaning. And lastly, your own kind of reflections, your own body, your own effect to your emotional experience when you're in the field, the sort of kind of sensory experience you have, things like that is a very important data source. Okay, next. What I think you could look out for, and what I usually do when I attempt to go into the field and collect ethnographic data, is exchange of value for access. And I know this is something to be very careful about and also to critically reflect upon. But that's been something that's been very, very useful in this context of the Schrage 26 paper, where basically the exchange of value was a calculation of living wage for those that gave us access, and then through that we gained access that would have been otherwise very, very difficult to get. So that is something one can do. Of course, you can access field sites also, just by not giving them anything, but that can be something that can be helpful. And then in that case, what was also super helpful was to follow one person to start with, and then through that we were able to access different meetings and eventually different sites and then different countries. So that's been very useful for us. And then something generally for in ethnographic research that's very, very helpful is to go informal, join car rides, lunches, factory floors, and say, almost yes to any kind of spontaneous data collection opportunity. I say almost because, of course, it depends on your context, and some contexts are really dangerous. And, you know, don't say yes to every dinner invitation, but sometimes that are exactly the kind of setups where you collect the most interesting data. And then build relationships, because trust is key in ethnographic research. And something, and now you can click again, that I personally think is very important is also to stay for longer periods. Ethnography doesn't have to be longitudinal, but I think it can be very useful. In two of my studies, one that I published with Juliane Reinecke in 24 and this Schrage 26 paper, we didn't actually plan to study what we did, but only because we stayed longer in the field, the cases eventually turned into something completely different. So you don't really know what you're studying until it happens, and often there are these trigger events or unexpected turnarounds that bring in a really cool new perspective that you didn't even consider. Next. Okay, so I think this is my last slide. No, almost. How to analyze ethnographic data. I think most important is that ethnographic data should be analyzed iterative. So you don't just go into the field and then you go home and then you analyze your data. But when you're in the field, sort of start to analyze your data already, because then themes may emerge and your research design may change and you may start ask different questions, and that all happens while you're there. So do that early on. But then, of course, it also depends on what you're interested in. So if you could click one more time. So for example, if you're interested in patterns, you may turn to thematic analysis, or if you're interested in language, and here I don't mean what people say, but really just the terms that they use to express what they mean, then you may look at discourse analysis. Or if you're like me, interested in temporality and these temporal dimensions, then you may use different part of Langley's process analysis approach. And what most people do, and I know that because I have actually just very recently looked a little bit across supply chain management studies and how they analyze the data, and most people within supply chain management usually turn to grounded theory, because that is a very helpful analysis method to move from your raw data to theorize. And it, especially if you work with Joya et al., and I know there is a lot of critique around that approach, but it can be extremely helpful as a guide to make sense of your data, especially when you're an earlier career researcher and sort of, new to that. Okay, now my last slide comes, and that is more or less just a visualization of how we have done. So how did we come from our raw data in the analysis process to then our output, if you want, so the paper and what we did. And here this is very small and you don't need to see what's written in the boxes, but this is the typical Joya tree. So, and we eventually actually got rid of this throughout the revision process, because we felt like it was restricting us and it stripped away too much of the necessary context to make our argument. But it was very helpful to sort of move from raw data to first order codes, second order themes, and aggregated dimensions. And then if you click again, from that, it's also very easy and straightforward to develop process models. So, for example, here in this model, the aggregated dimensions, the two faces, this is basically the red and the green circle at the left and the right. And then the second order themes are the two dark gray boxes and the four light blue boxes. That's sort of how a Joya tree can and often is sort of reflected in a process model. And then if you click again, and then that's then also how it translates into a findings section within a paper. So in an earlier version, the aggregated dimensions were our headings. So we had sort of a chronological kind of structure of our findings, and then our second order themes were the subheadings. So this is one way to go about it. But you can, of course, also organize your findings along the issue, or you can go very, very ethnographic and have more like these thick descriptions, these contextualized accounts. So it really depends on your study and the way that you go about sort of making sense of what you see. But that's what has worked really well for us in this ethnographic study in the supply chain context. Just as a summary, and now I'm done. I think you can click to the last slide. I said, like, take this with a grain of salt. Ethnography is really about immersing in the field, and that can mean very different things. And this is what it meant for me. And I hope it was sort of, it helps you make sense of your own data, but it can also look completely different, and that's also certainly right. So maybe as a helpful resource, visit the Ethnography Atelier. They have really cool, helpful presentations, boot camps, workshops where they also talk about how can I access the field, how to collect data, and things like that. So if you're interested in that, certainly makes sense to check that out.
Thank you so much, Julia. Very interesting presentation, very insightful. A lot of things that were also new for me. Thank you. We continue with Leon, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. I see already there are questions in the chat, which is great. Please keep them coming so we can have an insightful discussion at the end. Leon, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you, and thanks for having me. A lot of the things Julia was also talking about really resonate with me and my field work, so I think there will be a few parallels to draw. But to briefly introduce myself, I'm a PhD student from the Copenhagen Business School, and my PhD revolves around an ethnographic study. So Eugenia and Victoria have asked me to talk a little bit about my experience getting into ethnography and my sort of like learnings, what I got out from it. So let's go to the first slide. To give you a little bit of background on my research and the context, here in Denmark, we've recently had some new political institutions arise. During COVID, there was a new government agency created, the Danish Critical Supply Agency. Just a few years later, there was a new Ministry for Resilience and Preparedness, and last year, a new government agency for resilience, the Danish Resilience Agency was created. So there have been a few like new political institutions pop up to govern supply chains. So I was very interested in this political governance of supply chains, what that means, and what is actually going on here in this governance. So what I did was a 6-month ethnographic study where I was working from the offices of the Danish Resilience Agency together with the critical supply department and looking into how they try to create critical resource, how they secure critical resource supply chains and how they try to further resilience in some of those national supply chains. Let's go to the next slide. What really inspired me about ethnographic fieldwork was the affordances of the method. I was interested in this phenomenon, and I was like considering different ways to go about it, different ways to do qualitative studies, and interviews are by far the most common type of qualitative studies we see in supply chain management at the moment. But especially for this type of study where I was interested in this emergent phenomenon of political governance in these supply chains and how that worked, I also saw some drawbacks to that. So when we do interviews, we're very reliant on what people tell us. When we think about really study what people say they do or how people make sense of past events. So it's very much rooted in discourse. And that, of course, has some drawbacks. And that's not necessarily because people would lie about what they do, but just because what people say they do might not always correspond to what they actually do and how they go about things. And then there's also hindsight bias and post-rationalizations and lack of context that can make it a bit less interesting for me and my study than other types. Then observations are, of course, also really interesting and also, from my opinion, probably underutilized in SCM. And they're great at actually seeing what people do. But what really talked to me and was compelling about ethnographic research was not only seeing what people do, but also getting into the meanings behind it. Something that pops up in many of these like definitions when people talk about what ethnographic research is about is the social meanings. So what does it mean for these people to manage supply chains in some way or create supply chain resilience? And why do they do it in the way that they do it? So I thought that was very interesting and a good lens to study this emergent phenomenon and very much study it as it is in becoming it, as many of these toolboxes and ways of working in these political agencies are still arising and they're not fully fleshed out yet and very much like in becoming. And Julia was already talking a little bit about this iterative, very nonlinear process, and that's also very much how it worked for me. So I started out my field work, and one thing you might have thought was a bit peculiar was that I had these 2 agencies that I was doing field work with, but that was actually due to the empirical like reality, the social reality that caught up to my fieldwork a bit. Where in the middle of while I was there working at the offices, doing some interviews, meetings, observations, and so forth, I one day came to the office and one of my colleagues knocked on my door and was like, Leon, have you heard about what was announced yesterday? And I was like, no. And then he told me that the agency no longer existed. And the ministry had announced that there was a new agency. So now it was part of the Danish Resilience Agency and was a merger of different agencies. The Critical Supply Agency no longer existed. And then I got access and I was able to join a lot of different meetings between head of departments of this new agency while they were trying to design an agency to create resilience in a more holistic way, both covering supply chains and other things that would be relevant. So sometimes there's these opportunities that open up many doors, but also definitely are not what you would expect, and change things. Also, later through my research process, I changed my theoretical lens a few times, explored new things, and very much followed like a non-linear way where I already like analyzed my data and thought about what was going on while I was in the field, and then also changed what I paid attention to based on what I saw. To go to the next slide. Then there were a few like main or challenges I thought were interesting and I was reflecting on prior to the seminar also. One of the things that I didn't quite expect was the richness of the field when I first started my fieldwork. So when I first started doing the ethnography and I entered the agency with my researcher sort of mindset, having read some supply chain articles and so forth, I was quite overwhelmed by what was going on, and it was quite challenging to know what to pay attention to, what did I want to write down in my field notes, what was important, what wasn't important, just because there were so many things to note down, and I just knew I couldn't pay attention to all of it because it was too much. So what helped me to overcome and approach that problem was to have some sensitizing concepts. I was drawing especially from ideas and research and concepts on supply chain resilience at the time, different ideas of how to persist and adapt, and different processes of how that could work, as well as risk work and risk management and different ways in which risks are managed in the broader management literature. And then I also thought, especially as an early career researcher, I haven't had a full-time job or anything like that before. I was a student and I'm now a PhD fellow here. It was quite difficult to know how to behave, what to do when I'm in the field, how to interact with these people. Julia also briefly mentioned this was like influencing the data or influencing the field, because you are very much like a researcher that are there, and I was doing it overt. All the people knew I was a researcher, so I sometimes felt a bit like a foreign object. So what helped me be a bit more, make it a bit easier for myself how to behave was actually to not be afraid to interact with the people, to ask questions, be curious, because I would be there and people would react to me in some way either way. So I was trying to embrace that and just be curious. And lean into that also because when you challenge people and ask them questions, the way they respond to it can be extremely interesting data in some instances. And there were some cases where I was able to challenge someone on something or ask a critical question, and that actually led to a bigger discussion where I learned how they really thought about this and why they went about it in the way that they did. And the third one is that I think it's easy, and what I often hear is that people have like very strong expectations. It's easy to be very high in expectations of what you will find. But it's also important to remain open-minded and not have like a loaded dice where you will eventually find what you look for, but let the field guide you a little bit. So what helped me in that regard was trying to work pretty phenomenon driven, to not have a fully fleshed out research question, but I more or less had this phenomenon of this political governance of supply chains that I was interested in. And then I would reflexively try to adjust my research question and try to adjust what I was interested in, based on that, to keep my options open and a little bit broader. Then to go to the last slide, there's a few different resources. If you're just getting into ethnography or yeah, would like a little bit of advice that I can really recommend that helped me a lot in getting into ethnography and having a good idea on how to handle this methodology and what to do. Both Van Manen and this book, Being Ethnographic by Madden, that's more from the anthropology, are very good at giving like an overall understanding of how to conduct an ethnography. And the Madden book in particular is very like hands-on how to write field notes and different issues of writing ethnographic papers and so forth. But more specifically on the writing, the Jaszopkowski article from 2014 has a lot of info on or a lot of good also practical advice on how to write vignettes, for example, for your papers, while the Golden Biddle and Locke is very nice and at like giving general principles of how or what makes a good paper, or what makes good ethnographic writing, and what sort of principles and ideas apply. And lastly, what helped me a lot throughout the process was the idea of reflexivity, which Alvesen and Skölberg have written this book on, which is a lot about how to handle such like an iterative process, where you have to reflect critically on your positionality as a researcher and how you view things, but also it really enables you to take some decisions that make it more likely to stumble over some interesting and surprising findings. And if you have any more questions or anything that we can't cover in the Q&A today, you're always welcome to reach out. And thanks.
Thank you so much, Leon. It was really refreshing to listen to all your reflections. Thank you. Anna, you are next.
Thank you so much. Oh, and I would like to start by saying how much I really appreciated this invitation, because Victoria, you can actually go to the next slide. Because I'm Anna at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. And my work so far has mainly been published in management or organization studies journals. So I have not had the pleasure of writing really for the supply chain management journal yet. And also, although I do read actually, because I work with, my work has been all about following the tea trace, and working with tea companies, retailers, in the UK, in Europe, but also mainly with producers, tea farmers and workers organizations in East Africa, in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. So I think, and by the topic, of course, I read papers from ethical supply chain management, for example. There are researchers working on fair trade. So I've been reading and learning, but I haven't been able to really have a lot of conversation with supply chain management researchers. So, I was very, very pleased to receive the invitation, and I hope some of my experiences are still relatable to you. But I want to put that disclaimer there that, I may not be have a deep knowledge about your field, but I hope you still find it interesting for me to share a little bit of my experience. So as Eugenia mentioned at the beginning, I will share a little bit about my experience of around theorizing, framing, publishing, and going through the reviewing process with my project, but still, of course, rooted in my experience of doing all the ethnographic work. So I would like to, I worked on other ethnographic papers from other projects, for example, from Detroit or Kazakhstan. But today I really would like to use 3 papers or projects from my multi-sided ethnography in East Africa and also the UK and Europe, just for illustration. Of course, I will not go into details of 3 papers, but I will use some elements of these papers as examples. 2 were from working with fair trade tea farmers, organizations and communities in East Africa, one in AMJ and the other in ASQ. And one more paper is on the topic of mobile service innovation in Kenya, published in Organization Studies. And you can go to the next. And I'm very glad that Yulia already mentioned the idea of multi-sided ethnography, because I think it is actually really a good fit with supply chain management in general, right? Because a lot of ideas, the root of multi-sided ethnography in anthropology is really following something or somebody. So often people follow people. So basically, like, for example, immigration. So migration studies have been an important domain in multi-sided ethnography, where they sometimes follow coffee, they sometimes follow mushroom, they sometimes follow things, right? And then it often leads to almost following the entire supply chain, if you like. So that's been part of my project as well. So in a sense, my project was multi-sided ethnography in a dual sense. One is that I was also going around in 9 different communities in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. So it was multi-sided within East Africa, but also I was following the tea trade. So of course I had to go to the tea farming communities and factories, but also I had to go to Mombasa tea auction. And then I, of course, had to also work with organizations, companies in the UK, in Europe, all the way to customers. So that's been my journey. I ended up writing based on 8 different communities for one paper, and one community, the Kipsigis community, for another. That's my ASQ, and the mobile service innovation paper mainly from my observations and experiences in Kenya. You can go to the next. So once again, I will not go through the details of each paper, but I will just say that those 3 papers may look very different in terms of their theoretical grounding or literature or contributions. So my 2019 AMJ is all about temporality, long present perspective. My organization science is all about innovation, mobile service innovation, and trajectory dynamics in innovation. And the most recent ASQ about corporate social responsibility project using the angle of organizational legitimacy and social impact. So they are all very different in theoretical grounding, but they have one thing that's completely very common and uniting everything. That is that, in each and every of this project, I try to look at the very important critical role of local actors or target beneficiaries in many studies or many frames who are actually shaping the processes and outcomes of social impact creation and even organizational legitimacy. So for example, if someone is studying fair trade companies, initiatives, or CSI projects, or even, innovation projects to be implemented, rolled out in the global south, some people might see those local actors, producers, tea farmers, suppliers, in a sense, as almost passive beneficiaries of those social impact initiatives, or possibly someone even who might be negatively affected. So that some people might have an angle that, okay, they are there to be benefiting, or some critical scholars might study how such projects and initiatives and engagement might be actually harmful, but for those communities and organizations in the global south. But either way, they are often treated as passive actors. And I really was interested in looking at understanding the phenomena from their perspective, their experiences, and looking at their agency. So that's kind of the theme that unites all my projects in this context. And that also explains a lot of my methodological choices as well. So if you go to the next slide. So once again, my data collection also happened in the UK and other European countries, but I really wanted to understand the experiences from the perspectives or experiences of participants in East Africa. So it was very important for me to learn the language. I was never fully fluent in Swahili, but I learned Swahili. I did part-time language training for 14 months. And I was able to conduct interviews and observations in Swahili without interpretation. And that was a very deliberate choice to be able to get closer. Of course, I will never be really able to experience everything, but at least I wanted to be closer. You're seeing a photo of me, actually, picking tea leaves with a basket. So and I did that for 5 months in 2 different times, dry season and the rainy season, 3 months and 2 months. So, and that was also important for me, that I was often working full-time in tea farms together with workers and farmers, because, like I was working in the context of deep poverty, right? So, like I shouldn't be the one who is constantly taking just their time, like, because their time to pick tea leaves and the kilogram of tea leaves is directly related to their income, right? So when I was doing that, it really served several purposes. I was, of course, experiencing their work, but also I was able to, of course, talk with people while we were working together. And also at the end of the day, anything that I collected was, like, of course, a very small, tiny, but still a contribution to their income, because it wouldn't be so appropriate for me to just give them cash or anything like that. But at least, that was a way to say thank you to them in very, very small ways. So I was, of course, a lot of what Julia and Leon shared resonate with me, because, once again, it was not a context I grew up, but I still tried to speak in Swahili, even learn some other local languages like Kipsigis, to some extent, like traveling in local minibuses in the ways people would travel and spending time with them, eating, sleeping together, and so on. And I many of my a lot of my data also include visual data, photos and videos, but also drawings that were produced by the participants as well. You can go to the next slide. So you don't need to read anything here, but the point here is that, this choice of being closer is reflected like in all my methodological choices. So even in my data table, for example, I see a lot more interviews, observations, a lot heavy volume on the East African side than the European, the UK side. That's the only point that I wanted to share with this slide. You can go to the next. All right, so how do I go from these data and experiences to theorize, right? So, so once again, like we all do it differently, but once again, my focus was really to understand the processes and consequences and outcomes from the perspectives of tea farmers, tea workers, mobile service innovation users, and so on. So for example, like once again, I'm not going to explain the data here, but there were ways for me to understand through their interviews, through my observation, but also through their drawings, how they were perceiving, the sort of stated outcomes of social impact initiatives like fair trade, what they were going to do with schools and clinics and the prohibition of child labor versus what was the actual outcomes of those somewhat external initiatives. So of course, there were a lot of things that were actually rather problematic, at least in the long term, in terms of these initiatives, and I would capture them from their perspective. You can go to the next slide. But also, I was learning that they were never just passively there to be impacted, whether in terms of benefit or harms. They were also there actively to shape these things. So I was able to observe and make sense of how, for example, they were redirecting some of the resources, fair trade premium projects, to do something that really matters for their own context, like the concrete bench project and the beekeeping honey project, collection center improvement. And I was able to theorize what was really driving these kind of different approaches between fair trade and the producers, which I eventually theorized as long present perspective of tea farmers, as opposed to more short present perspective of fair trade in this case. You can go to the next slide. So same for my mobile service innovation paper. So it was very much about how the local users and agents in Kenya were almost like redirecting or taking the mobile service innovation into a completely different trajectory or direction from the original conception of the technology, if you like, that was developed in the UK, because such an innovation trajectory would be shaped and encountering and shaped together with local trajectories such as local migration trajectory and banking and business trajectories. You can go to the next slide. And oh yeah, somehow the title disappeared, but that was about my most recent ASQ paper that was really seriously engaging in the topic of agency of target beneficiaries in shaping social impact creation. And, like I developed this theoretical model. Once again, I'm not going to go through them, but you see clearly 3 actors, organizations and their legitimacy evaluators, but also target beneficiaries, who are often seen as being passive, but actually they totally reshape such initiatives to create their own social impact benefits and also legitimacy for organizations. So that was the theorizing I was doing in that project. You can go to the next slide. So that's I think that's my last slide before the thank you. So, like, of course, I went through them super fast, but I just wanted to highlight, how your theorizing or framing is also fully consistent with your methodological choices, right? Because in my case, okay, like I had that big motivation to really highlight the agency of local actors, suppliers, tea farmers in this case, or mobile service innovation users. And then it made sense for me to embed myself in that context and try to understand things from their perspective and, how they were shaping things from their end, not just being impacted. So that really impacted a lot of methodological choices. And, I know we really should go to the questions, but just a little bit about the review and publication processes. So, of course, as you can imagine, like a lot of what I was trying was quite new also to management journals. I think ethnography itself is perhaps rather, at least better established in the management field, but still, like the visual methods, drawings, the global South context itself, especially really seriously writing about agency of local actors in the global South. I don't think it was very common in the journals I was sending my work to. So of course there were a lot of explanations I had to do. I had to write quite long methodological sections, eventually to be edited and trimmed, but I certainly needed to explain a lot. But at least I think I was very lucky that, there were reviewers and editors who were open to looking into something new. So I actually experienced a lot of positive surprise also that actually they were quite open. They were waiting to be convinced, but they needed to be convinced. And I was often using, things that were established in other fields like anthropology or sociology or development studies to highlight that these are actually very established, legitimate methods and they are relevant for my topics. So I will stop there. I think the next is probably my thank you slide. Thank you so much, everyone. And I would love to discuss more with your questions.
Thank you so much, Anna, Julia, and Leon. Thank you so much for your insights. Victoria, I think you can stop sharing now. So I had a look to the chat and made a synthesis of questions. I think some of them were answered throughout the 3 presentations, but I will start with one. Feel free, Leon, Julia, Anna, whoever wants to respond, or maybe all of you briefly. Privacy and ethical approval, right? How do you deal with the privacy concerns when you need to share pictures, drawing, and all that? And how do you deal with the ethical approval, which usually happens at the beginning, but then it's such an iterative process and so many things happen in the process? How do you deal with that? First question.
Well, I was my PhD fieldwork was in the UK, but I'm in Canada, and also in Canada I work with Indigenous communities, Mohawk communities, and there are quite strict ethical review processes when we work with Indigenous communities in Canada. So I've been experiencing some different procedures, from the more sort of like maybe perhaps the lighter side and the more strict side as well. And of course, you will do, what you need to do in every context. But I think in a sense, what's perhaps even more important than the formal procedures always, I think, is the actual human element, right? Because in a sense, a lot of these procedures, they may come in different forms, and they might be sometimes, a little bit hard to to satisfy in every dimension. But the fundamental reason why we have such processes is because there were harms created, right? Historically, like in medicine, in psychology, in a lot of fields that, there were cases where, like people just go to indigenous communities or, like in any context, and they just, they can just mess around, right? Like they can just create like really big problems, literally harms, like to their safety, to their well-being, to their right. So that's the context why we have them. And in a sense, a lot of them is actually the human dimension of how to be respectful, how to be useful for them in a sense, at least, like if we are taking, some information, their time, like they are generously sharing their time, stories, then, what do we do, right? What do we do to be also somewhat, useful or sharing with them, whether that's knowledge or, some other forms of, often people do voluntary work for some of these organizations or communities. So I think a lot of them is down to that, even photos, right? Like I often take photos in a way that's kind of, like where the faces are small enough, or I take from the back, or, like they're dark enough, or like it's not that every ethics board will require me to do so. It's just a human thing, right? I don't want their faces to be flashed everywhere, right? So, and, a lot of, like asking consent, like just checking if they are comfortable. It's not about signatures, like a lot of the times I'm like, because I also work with communities and populations that are not necessarily textually literate. They are sometimes very literate visually, but they are not necessarily textually literate. So I often get a consent, like I get an approval, ethics approval, that I can operate based on verbal consent, not just the written consent and signatures. But what matters is that, I'm really talking with them and they understand me, and we are, we have that human relationship, and we have that trust, and, like, I'm going to be respectful, and I'm not going to be using the information and their generosity and their time in a way that's harming them, or, like, so I think it's really the fundamental human relationship that's guiding this. Thank you.
But I think it also shows some really great differences in what the problems are when it comes to fieldwork. Because in my study with the Danish Resilience Agency, it was often much more about confidentiality, as there were certain national security matters that were discussed. So we had a formal contract in place, and I was talking to them regularly about what I could include in my paper, what could be published, and I had to be mindful of what I would share with others, and what I would need to keep, and also how I stored and made sure that not other people had access or could get into my field notes.
Yeah, very good, very good. I'll move to the next question, which I think was something around length and when to stop. So how long should an ethnography study be, and when is the right, or how do we know when is the right time to stop, when we have enough data collected? I guess tricky to answer, but what are your thoughts there?
I will start again. Sorry to the other two. I mean, I'm a process researcher, so I would say never stop. Just keep going and stay with the case if it's interesting. I'm still on the same case that I started with my in 2015 when I started my PhD. And of course, then you have paper projects that come out of that ethnography or that case. But generally, you don't know really what's happening before it happens, kind of. So, but I think more practically, I think one person wrote, I'm teaching so many courses, like how to go about this. And I mean, different ways, either, 2 hours once a week, every Friday or so, or you can also, if you then have your condensed research times, you can also go into the field, but then maybe repeat that in the next year, have like 4 weeks every January or something like that. I think there are different ways, and there is no like, this is how you have to go about it. And then I think generally, like, when do I know it's done? If you feel like, okay, now I have enough to say to one theme that, or one thing that comes out of the data, and then that might be one paper project. But then I said, like, you can always continue. At least that's like from a kind of process point of view. I think that's the beauty about process research, to just keep going.
I agree with Julia, but maybe for different reasons. Not because I'm a process researcher, but I think an ethnography usually takes as long time as you have, and you should be in the field for as long as you can, or as it's practically feasible for you. But mainly because of the complexity of social reality, because it's like infinitely complex. There's just so much to study, and there's always new things coming up. So while in grounded theory you often have the idea of saturation, I don't really think that applies to ethnographic fieldwork in the same way. But then there's, of course, some norms of what we call an ethnography and how we use that terms. And I feel like there's been a bit of a norm that many of these ethnographic studies in management have been around minimum these 6 months. But there have also been terms used to communicate that, like just calling it fieldwork or calling it mini ethnographies, which are also very good ways of communicate what you're doing. But ethnographic work is also just such a flexible approaches that you can apply it in different ways, and you don't really have to fit a time frame. There's no real answer to that in quantitative terms.
I agree. I agree that, it's not a set term. But at the same time, like it is also true that we would probably not something on experience of 2 weeks as ethnography, right? So in a sense, like it's of course about that depth and richness and relationships. It's not just about the mechanical clock time, but at the same time, it's also true that some extended stay and engagement helps most of us to actually get to that richness and depth. So there's a little bit of a relationship there. In anthropology, usually it's in years rather than months, often, at least a year, if not longer. And in management, I think it varies but also it also depends on how you count, right? Because even in my East Africa project, it really depends on how I count. Because if I just count the time that I was really, in the villages of Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania picking tea leaves, I probably did that for about 5 months in 2 different times, 3 months and 2 months, but they were spread across about 2 years, 1.5 years, 2 years time. And within them was, of course, the Swahili training and all of that. And of course, if I also think about my work in the UK and East Africa, that I was following the 3-year corporate social responsibility project in real time, and also all the data collection that was happening like in the tea trays, then it's probably like at least 5 years. So, and do I also count my time that was my pre-PhD when I was working with these organizations as a person at Oxfam who was taking care of the fair trade project. So I think we do some counting to some extent to be accountable, but at the same time it really depends, and a lot of times it continues, right? I think that's very true. So I actually meant to go back. So I considered my 3 months and 2 months fieldwork as rather preliminary, and I actually meant to go back, and then I was pregnant without having planned. And of course, the East African communities took that as almost like the best reason not to come back, and they were very happy that I were becoming a mom. But that was actually the reason I could not return for the 3rd round of fieldwork. So sometimes personal circumstances, like there are many factors that almost force you to make these kind of choices. But I think there are ways to continue engagement. I certainly was in touch with them, even through text messages and calls. So yeah, I think, and I agree that, like people talk about exit, people talk about saturation, to some extent, yes, of course, some things might emerge and recur, to some extent, we make a choice of kind of exiting for now kind of thing, just as I was kind of like, yes, I was going to be writing for now that, I wasn't able to return immediately with my pregnancy. But, I don't actually believe that our relationships with the field end. That's not how I think about my relationships with the communities and study participants. So I think life goes on. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Anna, Leon, Julia. I have a few other questions on data analysis, ethnography versus case study, replicability, researcher bias. I think all excellent questions. We will not have time today to go through them. However, for everybody here, there will be a follow-up on the ethnography research. June 9, most likely with Lorenzo Scade. We will continue these conversations. Thank you all for joining. Thank you again, Anna. Julia and Leon, for sharing your excellent insights. And yeah, hope to see you, or many of you, next week during our next webinar on engaged research. Thank you all and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you so much
Thank you
for
very much.
organizing.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you so
you.
much for having me. It was
you
so
so
great
much.
to meet you all. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.